Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the DD Geopolitics podcast. I am Sarah, and that was the first time I've seen our new intro too. And I have to say that I am thoroughly impressed. Somebody said it's excellent intro, best that they've seen, and give the editor a raise. We're poor, so if you guys want to give the editor a raise, you're going to have to give the editor a raise yourselves. But anyway, welcome back to our guest, very good friend of the show, and former CIA analyst and thought leader, Larry Johnson. Larry, how are you today?
I am well. Thanks for having me.
We are going to talk about my favorite topic, the terrorist ratlines in the Middle East, the Levant through Central Asia today, which is literally one of my favorite topics. Kind of a throwback to an article that Seymour Hersh wrote, I believe in 2012, called The Red Line and the Rat Line. So starting off in Ukraine, the front line has pretty all but collapsed there. Just to catch up, what are your thoughts on the current state of the war, this high intensity and amount of momentum from the Russian armed forces, and the new intensity of the air campaign, and the likelihood of seeing a spring or summer Russian offensive?
I think the Russians are following the frog in the boiling pot of water method. In other words, the heat was turned on, started 2 years ago. And once Russia adjusted its strategy with the mobilization, realizing they were going to need more troops, they thought at the outset they could negotiate. But once they realized they were going to be in for a long battle, the priorities were to defeat Ukraine and recognizing at the same time that they were fighting NATO. So they were going to have to defeat NATO through a de facto struggle. But they weren't going to do it by putting their troops at maximum risk. So this grinded out defensive strategy that was in place for most of the first 24 months of the war has now shifted, and it's shifted in two significant ways. The degradation of Ukraine's air defense systems have made it easier for Russian planes to approach the front, and the increased use of glide bombs, these conventional bombs that have been modified and adapted so that they can actually be released at quite a distance from the front and be targeted with some degree of accuracy at key facilities, whether it's warehouses, power plants, thermal power plants, or hydroelectric power plants, railroads, storehouses, military bases. And this has created a dramatic increase in the violence that the Ukrainian troops are suffering. And it's not being applied in just one area. It is being applied all along the 600, 700 mile front, stretching from, Kherson in the south, all the way up past Kharkiv in the north. And, I think a lot of people are banking that Russia's going to launch a summer offensive. Unlike the West and unlike Ukraine, who kept announcing last year every other day, oh, we're going to launch this offensive. Oh, we're going to launch an attack. The Russians have been wise, in my view, to, if you're going to attack, you don't tip off your opponent what you're going to do. Don't show your cards. It's like playing poker and saying, look, here's all my cards. Let's, because you're going to lose. So this, I think what's going to go on is Russia will let the West continue to believe there's going to be some mass counteroffensive. They'll keep moving troops into different positions that will create concern on the part of Ukrainian military planners and their NATO allies, and that will force them to shift troops because they'll see a buildup, say, outside of Kharkiv. And so they'll ship most of their forces there, and then the Russians can just strike somewhere else because Russia's spread out, but with enough concentration that they can actually use this kind of deception, I believe, to take advantage of the growing paranoia and desperation among Ukrainian generals and among NATO planners.
So true. And so we're getting more upticks as this front line kind of collapses and the manpower gets diminished. What's normal and what we're seeing is an uptick in these kind of guerrilla one-off terrorist attacks committed by Ukraine. We know this is as a sign of a failing regime, but despite
Right.
signs, we're still hearing rhetoric, even as recent as yesterday or the day before, suggesting that Ukraine will be joining NATO in the very near future. And I know this is a
Yeah.
question and a stupid conversation, but in what world would the addition of Ukraine into NATO be a net positive
Well,
for
it won't. I mean, it's like I've drawn the it's a bit of a crude analogy, but it's poetic and graphic. It would be like having a guy with no arms and no legs join a track and field club, or join a volleyball team. What are they going to do? They can't set, they can't run, they can't move, and if you equip them with prosthetics, but it still imposes some limitations. NATO acquiring Ukraine brings nothing to the table. In fact, at that point, I could actually almost see Putin said, "Yeah, go ahead, add them." It's like getting rid of this leech of a brother-in-law that's always taking your food and drinking your liquor and messing up your house. Just get rid. Let them become somebody else's problem. But when the time comes for Ukraine to, quote, join NATO, and I doubt it will happen, but let's assume that there is still a Ukraine that can join NATO. It's not going to have a military. Russia is basically gutting it, taking every significant element of the Ukrainian military and destroying it, or destroying its artillery, destroying the helicopters, destroying armored, both tank and personnel carriers, and most importantly, destroying leadership. That's the most devastating thing that Ukraine has suffered. A significant loss of an entire generation of skilled military personnel, a lot of whom has spent much of the last 10 years training regularly with NATO forces. They're dead, they're gone. And that, you don't replace that overnight. That's, experience requires time. And that's what Ukraine doesn't have. It doesn't have time.
I think that's what's really unique about this war is the way that the attrition has kind of happened so quickly. But what this war also kind of reminds me of is we're creating this. It was already a puppet state, but this is even more of a shell of its former self.
Right.
It reminds me of the creation of the like Kosovo, a little bit of Albania, where these states, even after the wars, were kept kind of corrupt and poor at the behest of the United States, and then treated like terrorist training grounds and shopping centers. Is this kind of the road we're going down for Ukraine? Like another kind of Kosovo, another foothold of terrorism and illegal activity in Europe?
Well, I've always terrorism's always an evidence of weakness, because if you've got actual military force and capability, you don't have to turn to these terrorist attacks. And that I don't want to minimize the loss of life. I mean, for the families who lost loved ones, say in the Crocus attack, and frankly for Alexander Dugin, who lost his daughter. I've been fortunate to be able to deliver my condolences directly to him and his wife, having met them. They're wonderful people. But apart from the personal horror those people suffer, these terrorist attacks are meaningless. They do not affect military capability. More often than not, they end up uniting the population of a country against that threat, not dividing it, not undermining it. And so it's sort of it's a counterproductive strategy. But when people turn to it, it's like the reputation of the OSS the Office of Specialized Services during World War II for the United States, and the Special Operations Executive, SOE, for the Brits. All of this lore and this mythology surrounding it. And frankly, they didn't make a damn bit of difference to the outcome of the war. All right. And more often than not, they got a lot of their people killed because they had poor tradecraft, poor training, or, they may have killed a few Germans here and there, but it did not affect the outcome of the war. That was determined really over in the former Soviet Union. That's where the outcome was settled. So to the extent that this is Ukraine's best play, it's not going to change Russia's objective. And it's not like that Russia is not paying attention to this as a threat. What's happened in the Donbass over the last 10 years, since the Maidan in 2014, with attacks on civilian population, repeated attacks, and over 15,000 dead. The only good news is that the Ukrainians are not a bunch of murdering thugs like the Israelis. They've got their bad apples in there, but they have not been causing the kind of mass casualties on civilians that the Israelis have, if we're going to benchmark it and compare. Nonetheless, they still were attacking and killing civilians, which were acts of terrorism. Acts of terrorism that were facilitated by and enabled by the United States, the United Kingdom, and other NATO countries. So none of that's changed.
Do you think the West was in the Moscow attack? Because they kind of, which we expect them to kind of put their hands up and wash their hands of it. But how involved do you think that they were? It was a terribly executed attack as far as
right.
And attacks go. But how involved do you think the West was?
I think my own view of it is, and there's some disagreement. Ray McGovern has a different view, and I always enjoy debating it with Ray. I think the United States was aware that it was going to take place. I do not think that the CIA was the one who came up with this plan, number one, or number two, helped organize it and fund it. Doesn't matter. The point was the United States knew and didn't do anything to stop it. The most it did to stop it was a leak to the Financial Times 2 days before the attack, in which unnamed CIA officials were complaining about what they called unauthorized brazen attacks by Ukrainian intelligence service, and how counterproductive some of these things were, and how the Ukrainians would go off and do crazy things. I don't think that leak in the publication of that article was just a coincidence 2 days before the attack. It was the CIA's way to try to distance the United States so that, when the attack came, the United States would not be sitting there saying, Ukraine's always been doing things the right way. They were already putting on notice Ukraine's a bunch of crazy madmen. That said, the United States then immediately raised suspicion about its own involvement, because as the shooting was still going on, as the fire was still raging at the center, the White House, State Department would come out and say, "Oh, it wasn't Ukraine. We didn't even know how many attackers. We didn't know how many casualties. We didn't know what weapons were used. No investigation had been done. There was no Western official on scene to assist Russian authorities with the investigation. Yet here the United States, it wasn't Ukraine," raises the legitimate question. How the hell do you know? On what basis are you making that claim? What's your evidence? Or your evidence that, we have an arrangement with Ukraine that they'll only carry out terrorist attacks that we tell them to? Is that what you're saying? If I was Russia, that's one of the ways I'd interpret it. But that the United States was up to its ass in this. Yes, as an accomplice. The preceding terrorist threat that was issued, when U.S. Embassy in Moscow issued the warning on March 7th that there is going to be the possibility of a terrorist attack in the next 48 hours. They didn't say from now going forward. They specifically used the 48-hour period. They didn't quite mention when that 48 hours started. Was it the moment the announcement came out? Or was it the moment that thing was drafted, say 6 hours earlier? Or when did that 48 hours start? The point is, in my experience, having worked both at State Department and the Counterterrorism Office, where such warnings originated, where if we had credible information but lacked specificity about when, where, and how many were going to attack, we would make sure that a public warning would go out, as well as share that information with the host government intelligence service or security services. Well, never. And, my experience on this goes back to 1989. So, we're talking roughly 35 years. Never saw any warning where you specified the next 48 hours or the next week or the next month or the next year, because if it's going to be in the next 48 hours, that means you've got some specific information that you'll be able to prevent it, which means if you've got specific and credible, you don't need to go public with a warning because you can take them out. But that warning was then politicized, because when it came to an end after the end of that 48-hour period, then about 2 weeks later, actually a week after the attack at Crocus, CIA officials started leaking to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Seymour Hersh, pushing out the story. Oh, yeah, we warned those Russians. They just didn't pay attention. They knew it was coming. We told them, but they didn't listen. But at the same time, we didn't share everything we had. Now, which was it? You shared everything, or you didn't share everything that you had? If you didn't share everything that you had, then maybe you left out some critical details that if the Russians had known about it, they might have been able to do something about it. But the point was, if you're still warning after that initial 48-hour period, it was absolutely required under policy that a public warning should have been reissued. The public should have been warned, because I guarantee you, there were some American citizens at the Crocus City Center that night. And if any of them had been killed or wounded, it would have been on State Department for not having issued an appropriate warning.
Right. Well, we already know who did the terrorist attack in Moscow, but we still don't know who did Nord Stream. So, and we're still not 100% on 9/11, but we're good on Moscow.
Right.
Just for our listeners' sake, why don't you kind of tell them about how sometimes the CIA and the State Department's intel and even their goals don't really match? So is it, you said the CIA didn't know about it, but the State Department also issued a warning. So is it?
Yeah, no. So let's understand that the State Department's issuing a warning based off of intelligence. And in this case, there are only two types of intelligence. There is human intelligence from a human source, somebody who was involved with the planning, someone who had access to the planning, someone who knew what the group was going to do, would give that information up, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, to somebody that was working with or on behalf of the CIA, or alternatively, with or on behalf of some foreign intelligence organization like Mossad in Israel or MI6. Whatever, that human information would be written down, transmitted to the CIA, where they would disseminate it. That would make its way into the hands of State Department. The other source of intelligence could be an intercepted communication, an email, a phone conversation, but some sort of electronic communication that was captured and then written down and shared. And it could have, in this case, you had both, that there was human intelligence and that there was corroborating signal intelligence. With that, then State Department gets that, the Bureau of Counterterrorism, one of its duties, at least when I was there, was when you have this kind of threat information, you alert the Secretary of State, the Deputy, and the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, which used to be Victoria Nuland, and say, hey, we've got a serious threat here. we rate it as something that cannot be prevented. And therefore, since it can't be prevented, we need to warn people to stay away or to take precautions. I was there at the creation of that policy. That was back in 1989, and that came roughly 10, 11 months after the downing of Pan Am 103, an airplane that blew up over Lockerbie, Scotland, and killed all passengers on board the plane and killed, I guess, 20 or 30 people on the ground when the plane landed. But the issue at that time was it was perceived, falsely, I will add, that the U.S. government had advance warning of the attack and warned its own employees not to get on board the plane and let the other average Americans go to their death. Well, that wasn't the case, but we also didn't really have a firm policy in place regarding under what circumstances do you warn? What do you say? What are the guidelines? And so that's when the policy was developed. If you have credible information, but it's not so specific that you can prevent the terrorist attack, you will go public with a warning. So that's how the interaction between the agency and State Department. If the agency had information that it shared only internally with CIA and didn't share it with state and didn't share it with even the DNI, hey, shame on them. They endangered American lives. So that's part of, there's a part of me that thinks that this entire thing was staged. In other words, the initial terrorist threat warning, that was staged. That the warnings to the Russians, that was staged. Because we knew the attack was going to come later in the month, on the 22nd. And at that point, we wanted to use that attack as a means to further discredit Putin. And one of the ways to discredit Putin is to say, hey, he was warned and didn't do anything about it.
Well, that actually sheds a tremendous amount of light on it. So the terrorists in Moscow are caught. They are bewildered and they look maybe even drugged. But what we find out after that is that there were some sort of monetary transaction. It doesn't seem like an ideological attack, at least on the part of the perpatrators.
No, not at all. Not at all.
No, it kind of seems a little bit lost. Like, where am I? What have I done? At least one of them spent some time in Turkey recently. The full scope of the trip is we don't really know. What can you tell us about the implications of Turkey being involved in this somehow, and maybe provide some historical context on Turkey as a facilitator of terrorism? Does this have potential to impact Russia-Turkey relations, Russia-Israel relations, etc.?
Well, yeah, I think, look, Turkey has been a facilitator and enabler of Islamic terrorism for quite some time. They were involved with the United States in sending weapons to the so-called Free Syrian Army starting in 2012, actually starting, I think, 2011. But as the civil war got underway in Syria, it was getting underway in part because of funding from the United States and from Turkey and from the United Kingdom. Particularly, the United Kingdom and the United States were working in tandem in Libya to collect weapons from Libyan stockpiles and then ship them with the assistance of Turkey into the radical Syrians. And while it was ostensibly these former Syrian officers who were, aspiring Democrats, a lot of the weaponry from the Turks got into the hands of genuine Sunni extremists who wanted to wipe out the Shia and the Sufis in Syria. Now, I have, again, some firsthand experience with the British and American ties in Libya. Number one, the CIA base that was overrun, I guess was that September 2012. That base was huge by CIA standards. Normally at a CIA station, say in a place like Moscow, you might have, maybe you've got up to 15 to 20 officers and then some support personnel. To think about what was going on in Benghazi. You had over 25, 26 people at a base. I got contacted by one of my former CIA colleagues. He lives in California. He got a call. His wife actually got a request from a friend of hers. Hey, can your husband? He used to be in the government. Maybe you can help my husband out. He's behind on his taxes. So my CIA friend used to be. He was in charge. He was the administrative chief for the section of the CIA that dealt with what they call non-official cover officers. Those are CIA employees that are not officially aligned with the U.S. government in any way. They are, they work undercover, without diplomatic protection. They could be working as journalists or as doctors just like during back in 2009, was it? There was this woman named Norgrove in Afghanistan who was kidnapped, and she was an aid worker. She was building irrigation districts, but it turned out she was an MI6 asset. She was working for MI6. Anyway, my friends, he meets with this guy who's behind on his taxes. The guy walks in and says, well, I'll tell you, I'm a non-official cover officer for the CIA. And my friend goes, really? Because if this guy was a non-official cover officer, my friend would have known about it. So he started asking him questions and pulling his story apart. It turned out this guy, he was a former Army Ranger, had been kicked out of the Rangers for some, bad habits. He had been recruited actually by the Brits, MI6, and the Brits convinced him that he was working actually as an undercover, deep, dark, secret CIA officer. I mean, so that shows even how the Brits will screw you, even if you're supposedly on the same side. But those kinds of relationships were very active. So the funneling of those arms up into Turkey put the Turks directly in contact with these radical Islamic groups. And when the CIA base at Benghazi was overrun and destroyed on that attack that took place on September 11th, I guess it was 2012, a day before that, or the week before that, General David Petraeus, disgraced, was the CIA director. He traveled to Turkey and went to Ankara, met with Turkish government officials and intelligence officials, and said, hey, this arms shipment program, we're putting it on hold. Not going to continue, because they were concerned that it was going to create some political problems for Barack Obama's reelection campaign. And so they were trying to put away all the stuff that could create a mess. And then Ambassador Chris Stevens, 1 week later, was in Benghazi meeting with the member of the Turkish consulate, an intelligence officer, to coordinate on that end the shutdown of all this. So who's to say that the attack on that Benghazi facility could have been motivated as well by some of the Sunni extremist groups who were upset that they're getting cut off from weapons.
Well, funnily enough, you already mentioned it, but one of the terrorists did say that he visited Syria for training. So that's interesting. It's just
well, yeah, but whatever training he got, it sucked. I mean,
oh my God, they were so bad.
Watching these guys move and carelessly, carrying a rifle dangling down the right side. It just,
shooting from the hip. That's
yeah. I mean, they watched. They probably, they probably had them watch a series of Arnold Schwarzenegger movies.
Make it look training. Like
this. Yeah, act like these guys.
Another thing that kind of like made my radar go off. is that they immediately after the attack, I think it was the United States that was the first to say that they attributed it to ISIS-K or ISKP. Most people aren't really familiar with they know ISIS. They don't really know the branches, the Al-Nusras and the ISIS-Ks and all of that. What can you tell our listeners about ISIS-K? What if they're utilizing the same rat lines put in place by the Obama administration, and kind of like what their relationship is to Central Asia and Iran, maybe?
Well, I think ISIS-K is more of a Western label applied to a Sunni extremist group based largely in Afghanistan with ties into Pakistan that became convenient for the U.S. to label it as ISIS-K. Let's remember, ISIS emerged in 2003, shortly after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And it was initially not known so much as ISIS. It was really considered part of Al-Qaeda. And Zarqawi, who became sort of the head of ISIS, was dealing with Ayman Zawahiri, bin Laden's number 2 guy, and bin Laden. And at one point, part of the goal of that early ISIS was to kill Shia Muslims, because they saw the Shia, when Saddam Hussein was running Iran, he was a Sunni, but the majority of the population were Shia. And so when Saddam was overthrown and the Shia, by virtue of the West putting them now in charge, spiked outrage on the part of these devout Salafists like Zarqawi. So he started attacks against the Shia, and was more of the terrorist. Well, that was interesting. More of the terrorist attacks by ISIS in the early days were directed against Shia, not against American troops. And it got so bad that Zawahiri, the number 2 guy, the old Egyptian preacher, and bin Laden, they sent Zarqawi a letter chastising him, basically saying, "Hey, knock this off. Stop. We're all." It was like a Rodney King moment. Can't we all just get along? Can't we get together here? Because they wanted him to join forces with the Shia to attack the Americans. But that wasn't what Zarqawi had in mind. They finally killed him in June of 2006. And I was just coincidentally, I had been asked by the Special Operations Command to go to Iraq to, of all things, train a Navy SEAL on how to be on television, how to do interviews. So they sent me into the war zone, and I was up at the base in Balad, Iraq, where the center, the Special Operations Center, was located, and the hunt for Zarqawi was on. And a week after I left, they got Zarqawi and killed him. So, of course, I always took credit for that. I said, well, they hadn't found him. I went, then I come out, and they got him, so you draw your own conclusion. ISIS then sort of morphed, and as it moved into Syria, that Assad became a target, because Assad, again, was seen sort of as a secular guy, but linked with the Shia, but he was Sufi, and he actually provided some measure of protection for different religious groups, including Jews, and didn't sit well with these ISIS adherents. So then they spun up. And it's at that point that Turkey gets involved with the group, because Turkey wants to dump Bashar al-Assad. And then that the United States, through its ties in Turkey, gets linked up with these groups. So you get this really odd situation that on the one hand, the United States has declared ISIS as this terrible threat. We need to stop them. That was the DIA assessment that was issued when General Mike Flynn was there. I know that because I just had lunch with his brother today, and we were talking about this coincidentally. And then on the other hand, we were trying to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, and there'd be times when the Syrian army fighting ISIS and the United States would bomb the Syrian army, not ISIS. Think about that. So that's why there was this, let's call it start of a collaboration where number one, ISIS became a convenient excuse to build up the Department of Defense budget. Oh, we got to fight ISIS. But on the other hand, the intelligence community, depending on the situation and time, would find a way to work with them, or at least find a way to have contact with them. The CIA, under direction from the Bush administration, did the same thing with a terrorist group in Iran called the Mujahideen al-Khalq, MEK, where they used to be on a terrorist list, and then all of a sudden they're off the terrorist list, and they're good guys, and we're giving them money and giving them
I'm so glad you brought up the MEK, because my next question was about the attack in Iran, the two attacks. So we had the pipeline and we had the memorial of the General Soleimani, the pipeline. Coincidence, right. But these attacks looked more like a terrorist group, and I initially thought this looks like the MEK, especially the pipeline. For our listeners, the MEK is a terrorist group that's housed in Albania and kind of fostered and kind of armed and trained by the West. They use them as they use them in like call center scams and weird things like that as well. But did you think of MEK in the attacks on Iran? I felt like I know that Iran said, the ISIS-K really isn't a threat to us anymore. They're really like disbanded, and the ones that are left are more like hired guns and mercenaries. So what is the likelihood that that there's MEK involvement in this as well?
Well, it may not only be MEK, because the attacks that took place in Iran this last week came out of the southwest, out of Baluchistan. And the CIA has had long-standing relationships with members of those tribes in Baluchistan. The Baluchis they live in the far eastern border of Iran, and the western border of Afghanistan, and the western border of Pakistan. So right there on that whole border where those three countries come together, you have this contingent of Baluchis who have always been, they've been at odds with the Shia majority for quite some time. I know for a fact from a friend of mine who was part of a top secret intelligence organization who was involved with the attempt to rescue American hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran back in 1980, that intelligence that was being gathered by the United States was being provided by people in Baluchistan, rug merchants, who literally would put their communications concealed in these rugs that were wrapped up, shipped to the United States, shipped to Bethesda, Maryland, and shipped to a particular rug store that is on Wisconsin Avenue. Letter begins with a P, because I used to actually live directly behind that rug store. And it was sort of funny that, but that's how the intelligence was coming in, through those rugs. So, that was 50 years ago. So just think about this, that the CIA was dealing with those groups then, and I guarantee you they're dealing with them now. The reality, in my view, Iran is classified by the West as the major sponsor of international terrorism. And I think a very compelling empirical case could be made that, in fact, the United States is the major sponsor of international terrorism, not Iran. And it has carried out these terrorist attacks in Iran, proxies. And it may very, very well be tied, at least indirectly, to this latest attack in Moscow.
So now we'll even go further, because yesterday Russia and China, maybe China's held talks about strengthening intelligence sharing and combating terrorism in their region, share region in Central Asia. Can you tell our listeners about how these rat lines are used to transport even Uyghur extremists from the training grounds in Syria and Turkey all the way to Xinjiang, which commit attacks to destabilize China, especially given that Xinjiang is Muslim and is chock full of natural resources, and it's very necessary to the Belt and Road Initiative. Will we be seeing, now that we're seeing these cells kind of get activated in a domino effect, what is the likelihood that we'll see an uptick in violence in the Xinjiang region with these same sorts of people?
You've got, all I can say is there's 75 years of history. If anybody wants to dig into it and get example after example, I recommend a book by Tim Weiner. That's spelled Weiner. He was with the New York Times. The book is titled Legacy of Ashes, and it's a history of the first 60 years of the CIA. But what is clearly documented in that book, we're not talking one or two instances of attempted regime change and subversion. We're talking thousands. During the Eisenhower administration, during 8 years of that administration, they were involved with over 150 covert actions by the CIA at the direction of the president. And then John F. Kennedy, who was lionized as this New Deal kind of guy who was going to restore peace and dignity. And in just the 2.5 years that he was president, they did more than 163 covert actions. So he was on pace to do twice as many. And these involved actions in Central America, South America, Cuba. It was, Vietnam was the real big disaster that was unfolding. So is it any surprise that there may be efforts underway to create and fund opposition groups in China, ostensibly to counter communism, but the real goal is, as you identified it, there's gold in them hills, baby. Black gold,
Black
Texas
gold.
tea, whatever the resources are, that's the target. So, it's just the United States has this habit. It's like a serial rapist. Best way I can describe it.
Exactly. And it's amazing how, we have our new axis of evil, which is China, Russia, Iran, and we see same terrorist group uptick in Iran and Russia, and now China's saying we better get our security and our intel sharing back on point. It's pretty I guess they think we're stupid. I mean, I guess we are kind of stupid. So we've done a round robin. We have two conflicts going on, hot conflicts going on in Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, but they're both just Western-backed proxies that are using terrorism against the axis of evil. What does this spell for the world, for us? We have what we can visually see as these two hot wars, but really what's going on in the back end is so much more important and is so much more effectual to the actual world.
Well, we're witnessing breakdown of international law, the collapse, and the symptoms of it are widespread. Let's take an example. In Brazil, you have a guy currently as president, Lula, who was arrested, convicted, charged, and jailed, and then freed from jail, then runs and wins. And some say it's under questionable circumstances. And so what does he do? He turns around and is targeting Bolsonaro, his predecessor, for the same thing. In the United States, you've got a complete breakdown of the judicial system with active use of every legal trick in the book and crooked judge to go after Donald Trump, and where just, was it last week that the Biden administration was criticizing the government of India for launching a criminal investigation of an opposition political candidate? And the Indians basically came back with you got to be shitting me. You're the ones that are trying to lock up Donald Trump, and you're lecturing us on how to treat political opponents? They basically say, go screw yourselves. Mind your own damn business. So you've got that. But you also in India, you have that kind of disruption. In Ukraine, you got Zelensky saying, nope, no elections. We're a democracy, but we're not going to have any elections. Got to call it off. This war is too bad. The only one of late who's actually held a legitimate election, even though the world wanted to condemn it as not, was Russia. Yeah, they actually held an election, and at the end, it was sort of nice to see the opposition political candidates got up on stage with Putin, and they all pledged their allegiance to Russia, not to the Communist Party, not to the Socialist Party, not to the Putin Party, but to Russia. That Russia became the unifying thing for them. Political differences, yes, but a unifying love of country. Then we've got this complete breakdown of the sanctity of diplomatic facilities. Well, Israel bombs the hell out of Iran's consulate, kills 2 senior generals and some other people, a complete violation of the Geneva Convention. Then 2 days ago in Ecuador storms the Mexican embassy, takes somebody who'd sought refuge and was given safe haven. Complete violation of diplomatic protocol. So that's what I'm saying. We're not looking at one isolated example of genocide or criminal activity. And hey, the United States is bombing in Yemen, attacking the Houthis with no UN resolution to support it. Just doing it because the United States said we can. The good news out of that is it's making the United States look foolish, because now going on almost 5 months into this attack on the Houthis, they're still launching, they still got the Red Sea closed down. And the United States, with all of its military power, can't get it open.
No, they're now going to try to negotiate with Int'l Law, while the commanding officer of the WWIII Eisenhower talks with pro-Ukrainian NAFO trolls online. Like, the whole thing is just an laughable, ridiculous joke. But while I'm through all of my questions, but I'm going to go for a bonus one since we have a little bit of time. I want to get your thoughts on Israel, Palestine, with this Rafah invasion, possible northern front against Lebanon, Egypt. What is going on in this situation? Netanyahu has said that the Rafah plans are written, they're good to go. Our government is saying we want to avoid an invasion of Rafah. What is this kind of tug of war between the United States and Benjamin Netanyahu? What's going to happen in Israel in the near future? And what does it all kind of mean?
Makes me wonder if General Zaluzhny has gone down to Israel to help plan their counteroffensive. Because this is the same playbook. Hey, we got our plan. We're going to attack in Rafah. Hell to that. So Rafah, get ready, because here we come. This way. Who does that? I mean, what sane military leader shoots their mouth off like that in advance of an attack? So I'm sitting there scratching my head listening to Netanyahu say this. It's possible he's just saying it for political effect to keep the crazy man Itamar Ben-Gvir silent, because Ben-Gvir says, if you don't attack Rafah, I quit and you'll be out, So it could be that. It could be real, that they're actually going to do it, even after the United States has said, don't do it. Don't you do it. Don't do it. And if you do it, we're going to write you a very stern letter. It will not look good in your fitness report. Or that this is a complete deception, that Ben Netanyahu's announcing the attack in Rafah in order to lull Hezbollah into complacency, because they're really going to attack. They've withdrawn the units and they're moving them north because they're going to launch an attack into southern Lebanon. Those are the three possibilities. I have, but again, it's like shades of Zelensky and Zelensky.
That's what I keep seeing. Like, and it's funny because Palestine is such a front and center cause and conflict that, you know, you get these people who aren't so involved in politics or geopolitical analysis. They come out of the woodwork, and I'm like, this is the same playbook from Ukraine. Like, if you guys were around for the last 2 years, we'd be much more better equipped to deal with this. The propaganda, the attacks, it's just like Ukraine, the irrationality, the level of fascism. So it's like, when I do these shows, and that's why I kind of took you around Robin, I like to show how everything's connected, because people think that once we get a ceasefire in Palestine, like, that's the end. They don't understand how what's happening in Palestine is directly influencing and influenced by what's happening in Ukraine. And that's because these networks that have been laid out in order to connect these areas.
Well, they're beginning to think, you know, the Western policy, foreign policy on this kind of issues is akin to, you know, a 3-year-old child with a hammer. The 3-year-old just sits with a hammer and bangs everything. You know, it's just, that's what it's for, to bang. And there's no nuance. There's no sitting back and saying, hey, maybe we should take a different approach here, or what's the best approach? You know, nah, hit everything with a hammer. If it's moving, hit it with the hammer. And just think about this. If the United States, with a carrier task force, cannot stop the Houthis, who in their right mind thinks that a U.S. attack on Iran would bring Iran to its knees? Please. You know, can everyone get a grip on reality and stop with these war porn fantasies?
Just a fun fact for you and our listeners, I actually deployed on the ship that is now in the Red Sea, monitoring the Int'l Law. And ever since I left, I feel like that ship has really just gone to hell. Helen. Yeah. Now that I'm retired, the Navy is a shell of its former self.
Well, what was the longest cruise you had? Do you recall?
I did 7 in 2016.
But the longest one in duration.
So 7 months, yeah, 2016.
7 months?
Yeah,
because they're coming right up on 7 months now. I mean, I think they departed Norfolk in September, and so you got October, November, December, January, February, March. We're coming in 8. We're in 7 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's not unheard of to do a 9-monther, but I mean, the fact that we've got what we are told to believe is a ragtag group of, you know, barefoot Arabs holding up the Navy while he's posting memes with NAFO is very telling. Like that, this whole is like a very great extended metaphor for the state of our military. Right. Yeah. Transgender women giving speeches, and then a dude who is literally in a war zone at the tip of the spear is posting dog memes on Twitter. It's really incredible. We live in amazing times.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. Send that to me.
Hey, Aria, can you put it up on the screen? The NAFO, the commander, what does he call himself? Chowda something? If he's here, maybe he's not here, but yeah, he posted a NAFO dog meme today. It was very great. Yeah, but I'll send it to you. So that's why Int'l Law is beating.
Oh yeah, there it is. Oh my God.
On that Larry's face.
Unbelievable.
Any thoughts on the NAFO dog before we get the episode? We'll just end with Larry shaking his head.
I wonder if the commander has a collection of Barbie and Ken dolls.
Seriously, it's like dealing with a Reddit teenager. Like,
yeah.
That's really incredible. Okay, well, why don't you tell our listeners where they can find you and what you're up to?
Yeah, so I post primarily at sonar21.com, and then from there it has all the links to my other outlets, Patreon, Substack, YouTube, BitChute, and Rumble. So
Well,
I do a little
thanks.
bit on Twitter, but I'm not much of a social media maven, but you know, I do enough to, like, for an old guy, I know what I'm doing.
I think so. We're doing all right. Well, thank you, Larry, and thank you to all of you. Friday night, we will be back with Professor Danny Shaw, who was just fired for supporting Palestine. Please visit ddgeopolitics.com. Eid Mubarak and happy Ramadan to all of you, Larry. Please, and thank you for joining us, and please enjoy your week.
Thanks so much.